Alright you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called California Ceasefire. Right now in California, a modern day phenomenon is playing out in the gang world that nobody thought would ever be possible. Even some of California's most prestigious gang scholars and gang investigators never thought that this would happen. After almost 7 decades of bloodshed, after thousands of murders that took place both in prison and on the streets of California, a faction of the Nuestra Familia, as well as the Mexican Mafia, have forged a ceasefire. And by all accounts, at least as far as the state faction is concerned, it's legit. On its face, it's being recognized as a Norteño Sureño truce, but in all actuality, it is these two criminal organizations, the NF and the M, that are behind this unforeseeable phenomenon. Because let's be honest, without the blessings of the Nuestra Familia or the Mexican Mafia, the truce between the Norteños and the Sureños just couldn't be possible. Peace talks between these two organizations go back as far as the early 90s, when former leaders of both groups attempted to gain the assistance of then Governor Pete Wilson and his advisors. The plan called for then Governor Pete Wilson's advisors to come in and act as mediators. However, things broke down when some of the younger members of both groups expressed strong opposition against the possibility of a peace treaty. This caused dissidents and infighting within both groups, and in fact this led to some of the main proposers being assaulted or cast out of these two organizations. The M's infighting took center stage between the late Benjamin Topo Peters and the late Ruben Tupi Hernandez. Both of these highly influential former leaders took up a position that was either for or against the peace treaty. Topo was for it and had the political backing of other MA heavyweights such as Mike Acha Eisen. But Tupi on the other hand was firmly against it. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, the NF's infighting also took center stage between Ralph Old Man Rafa Rubio and Robert Brown Bob Viramontes. Old Man Rafa was the original lone catalyst who had embarked on a personal mission to accomplish this himself. He did have the political backing of other highly placed NF leaders, but at the time they had no desire to be identified. The political climate in those days was just too sketchy and peace wasn't a popular topic. At any rate, Rafa's biggest adversary, who was clearly in opposition of it, was Brown Bob. He stood firmly against it and perceived any measure of peace to be an act of treason. At the time, another hotbed issue that was also on the table between these two organizations was the clarity of the door policy. Both groups agreed that some ground rules clearly needed to be meted out, but what this consisted of and how this was going to be agreed to was still a basis of contention. At the time, prior to reaching a consensus on this particular issue, Pelican Bay Shoe was a designated no-fly zone, or a war zone. If the doors opened and you found yourself on the tier with an adversary, you were obligated to take flight and engage. But in the 90s, this was happening with some frequency, and a lot of people were getting shot for what was considered an aimless purpose. A lot of us believed that this was a game that the gunners were purposely playing, and that they were doing this to justify shooting the combatants. Therefore, it was agreed that we needed to devise a policy that would afford some discretion to the parties involved when this situation occurred. If there was no immediate threat or any display of aggression, then you could step out on the tier, make your presence be known, and then step back in without incident. If a threat was posed and acts of aggression were evident, then you could get it and get your money. Either way, however it happened, it took the power away from the gunners and instead levied the discretion back in the hands of those directly involved. After some major changes took place within CDCR, new leadership overseeing both groups and other causations that were a direct effect of the class action lawsuit, the Nuestra Familia and the Mexican Mafia became the architects and the engineers of a truce that has so far lasted. On July 8, 2011, 4 Pelican Bay Shoe inmates who were all alleged leaders or influential members of one of California's big 4 prison gangs, the Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Aryan Brotherhood, collaborated to organize a statewide hunger strike for the purpose of protesting long-term incarceration and solitary confinement, inadequate prison conditions, and a debriefing practice that Pelican Bay's gang intel unit were openly using to keep some inmates locked in the shoe for 10, 20, and even 30 years. And this was founded on slipshod validation procedures that were being effectuated on hundreds of inmates who weren't even legitimate prison gang members. Todd Ashker, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, Arturo Tablas Castellanos, a member of the Mexican Mafia, Sitawa Jamal, a member of the Black Guerrilla family, and Antonio Chuco Guillen, a member of the Nuestra Familia, were the 4 inmates who coordinated the 30,000 inmate statewide hunger strike. When the hunger strike was effectuated, the prison administration took immediate notice about a telltale common denominator that all these inmates allegedly shared: that they were all highly placed leaders within their respective prison gangs, and that they all exhibited a massive amount of influence over the prison population. The hunger strike started in Pelican Bay State Prison, but it is believed to have been a coordinated effort that spread to other California prisons and some of the bigger county jails in California. Mandates were facilitated and orders were filtered out through the prison grapevine. The prison grapevine is a surreptitious network of covert communication that is manifested through the inmates using unconventional, improvised methods. It can consist of everything from sign language, kites that are written in micro mini print, coded letters, all the way down to carnival talk that's facilitated and passed on to visitors and the inmates' families who are already showing their support and assistance on the streets. Carnival talk is basically coded metaphors that are utilized to conceal sensitive information. Example: Mike came by to do the lawn and said he'd give me $50 a month to help buy groceries. To the untrained ear, this wouldn't mean nothing more than Mike, the gardener, coming by and that he helped with some grocery money. But to someone who understands the verbiage, this means Mike came by and checked in, and every month he will be contributing $50 for the regiment. The hunger strike that was initiated by the inmates definitely got the ball rolling and led to a lot of political scrutiny on Pelican Bay State Prison and the psychological impact it was having on the inmates. But it was the class action suit filed by inmates Todd Ashker and Danny Troxell that opened the floodgates and paved the way for a litany of changes that would later come. On September 1st, 2015, a federal court agreed that the plaintiffs Todd Ashker and Danny Troxell, citing that it would effectively end indeterminate long-term solitary confinement in all California prisons. The ruling also stipulated, subject to court approval, that the agreement would result in a dramatic reduction in the number of people in solitary confinement across the state and a new program that could be a model for other states going forward. Ashker contended that California's use of prolonged solitary confinement constitutes cruel and unusual punishment and denies prisoners the right to due process. This settlement represented a monumental victory for prisoners and an important step toward ending solitary confinement in California and across the country. California's agreement to abandon indeterminate SHU confinement based on gang affiliation demonstrated the power of unity and collective action. With the assistance of extensive expert evidence, the case established severe physical psychological harm among California SHU prisoners as a result of prolonged solitary confinement. Ashker and Troxell worked with 10 experts in the field of psychology, neuroscience, medicine, prison security, and classification, as well as international human rights laws. The lawsuit was a masterpiece. It was well written and produced results that even the plaintiffs themselves didn't think that they would prevail on. Some of the resulting reports provided an unprecedented and holistic analysis of the impact of prolonged guidance in the construction of the settlement reforms. Aside from the detrimental effects of prolonged solitary confinement, the suit also covered other areas such as California's unregulated practices of segregation and discrimination based on sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, or gang affiliation. Although California often implemented some of their own unconventional techniques to avoid problems between inmates, the court recognized this as a violation of their constitutional and civic rights. I mentioned this in my profile on Pelican Bay. It was the practice of selling up inmates who were of different ethnicities. But although the court's intentions were good and were only to restore some of the constitutional liberties that it felt inmates were being deprived of, this would actually create a landslide of other problems that were not anticipated by either the courts or the plaintiffs. When the federal court's rulings came down, inmates Ashker and Troxel were both housed in Pelican Bay's Short Corridor, a small area in the SHU between D1 and D4 that the administration was using to house gang leaders and some of the more assaultive inmates that they felt needed to be separated from the other SHU inmates. It was at this time that rumors began to float around that CDCR was going to start transferring inmates out of the SHU and that the vast majority of them were being given back their mainline status. This is also when peace talks between the gangs began to ramp up and the idea of a real peace treaty was being kicked around. Everybody seemed to be on board with it, but there were still a lot of skeptics and a lot of people just didn't believe that these four criminal organizations could actually coexist or play nice together on the main lines. Too much blood had been spilled over the years, and peace talks in the past either broke down or just didn't have the type of internal backing or internal support that it needed. Most of the players who were involved in the initial talks were either dead or had fallen into bad standings as a result of their participation. Old Man Rafa was found guilty by the NF of treason and was now on bad standings. Topo and Acha had both passed away and were no longer part of the MA's leadership. Tupi was later deemed no good and stabbed by the MA. His indiscretions when it came to his use of methamphetamines had made him paranoid and reckless. After disrespecting fellow Imero Raymond Champ Mendez, a vote was held and he was put in the hat. In December of 1996, he was stabbed at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles by fellow Imeros late Daniel Black Dan Barella, Jesse Pelon Moreno, and Raymond Champ Mendez. Later, he would end up falling off the deep end before he too would end up passing away. But this mass SHU release changed the dynamics of everything, and everything else that needed to be in place to make something like this work all seemed to be lining up. The Nuestra Familia knew that it could forge a truce with the MA behind the walls, and this was the only thing that they were concentrating on in the beginning stages. But Sureños had also migrated to Northern California, and the NF wasn't confident that this truce could also be extended to the streets. Controlling the Norteño street gangs and getting them to agree to stop a conflict on the streets with an adversary that had basically infiltrated their neighborhoods was going to be a challenge and involved a multitude of other problems of its own. Prior to the class action suit coming to fruition that spurred the federal courts to impose a laundry list of changes for CDCR, California was already trying to find a way to deal with implementing changes that AB 109, aka the Realignment Act, required. This was a soft on crime initiative that was passed into legislation on April 12, 2011. The initiative changed the way California was supposed to deal with low-level felonies for the purpose of reducing prison overcrowding and an overall goal to reduce recidivism. So after years of California taking a tough on crime stance and locking people up under the 3 Strikes You're Out initiative, lawmakers and the public seemed to be softening their position. The days of lock 'em up and throw away the key just wasn't working, and taxpayers were tired of seeing their tax dollars get swallowed up by the prison industry. So eventually CDCR began reclassifying inmates that had previously been warehoused in the SHU, and they began funneling them out to different California prisons. So this is where they are now, and still to this day the truth seems to be holding. Some would argue that the massive release and the reclassifying of all the SHU inmates has been a success in some ways and an epic failure in others. Everyone knows that having the leaders of these 4 prison organizations on the main lines has had somewhat of a correlating and transcending effect on the streets, especially when you consider the introduction and access that they have at cell phones. On the flip side, the mere presence of leadership for all 4 of these organizations has introduced the old school way of doing business back, and a lot of the veteran officers like this. They run tighter shifts, and the prison environment has become a lot more respectful and professional. But with the good also comes the bad. Murders are being planned and facilitated, and drug transactions are being coordinated with fluid regularity. Like I've said on many occasions, there is no more lag time. Everything now happens in real time, and this eliminates any possible chance of law enforcement infiltration or detection. Still currently, CDCR is still trying to figure out how to deal with this new caliber of inmate that was released to their yards, and how to now manage a prison system that has been stripped of some of its most effective tools. You now have groups of bona fide NF members, MA members, AB members, and BGF members walking around and associating and fraternizing on the yards. Sometimes in groups of 5 or 6. That's crazy. When the killing started to take place on some of these yards and the house cleaning began, that's when CDCR really understood the severity and gravity of what it was that they were really up against.